He was a king erased from Egypt's monuments, a ruler whose skin heritage and story were buried beneath the golden myths of pharaohs. He came from the south, from Nubia, a land of warriors and poets, and for a brief moment in history, he held the heart of Egypt in his hands. But why was his name forgotten? Why does no one speak of the Black Pharaoh who once ruled the greatest empire on earth? Tonight we uncover a story buried deeper than any tomb, one of pride, conquest, and silence. The story doesn't begin in Egypt. It begins further south, beyond the first cataract of the Nile, in a land called Kush, modern-day Sudan. A land of black soil-rich culture, fierce warriors, and people who had admired and feared Egypt for centuries. They had traded with them, fought them, borrowed their gods, and slowly, quietly, they had grown powerful. By the 8th century BC, Egypt was no longer the unified giant it once was. The grand pyramids had long stood silent. The royal bloodlines had fractured. Egypt had splintered into smaller kingdoms, ruled by rival warlords and fading dynasties. There was no single pharaoh, only chaos, corruption, decline. And in that vacuum came an outsider. His name was Pianki, or as some pronounce it, Piye, a king of Kush, a devout man, a brilliant tactician, and a black African ruler who believed he had been chosen by the gods not just to rule Nubia, but to restore Egypt itself. He didn't march north with arrogance. He marched with faith. Carrying his horses, his banners, and his priests, Piye set out from Napata, not to conquer, but to cleanse. He saw Egypt's weakness as a moral failing, its division as an affront to Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of truth, order, and balance. He believed he was restoring what had been lost, and remarkably, Egypt accepted him. City after city fell not in rebellion, but in relief. The people welcomed him as a restorer of the old ways, a man who respected the gods, who knelt in temples, who wept at sacred shrines. In Memphis, Thebes, and Heliopolis, his name was carved in stone. His devotion spoke louder than any army. He never called himself a conqueror. He called himself Pharaoh, but not just any Pharaoh, a true one, anointed by the gods, and black like the soil of the Nile itself. For the first time in centuries, Egypt was united under one ruler, and that ruler was a Kushite. And yet, history would soon forget him. When Piye died, he was buried in a pyramid, not in Egypt, but back in Nubia, on a sacred hill called El Kuru. His tomb was decorated in Egyptian style, filled with traditional symbols and blessings. But there in the heart of Africa, a new legacy had been born, a dynasty of black pharaohs who would rule Egypt for nearly a century. They are known today as the 25th dynasty, but you won't find their statues in Cairo's grand museums. Their names are missing from school textbooks. Their images, if they exist at all, are often whitewashed or downplayed. Why? Because they challenged a narrative the ancient world, and later the modern one, wasn't ready for. They proved that African kings, black kings, could not only match Egypt's greatness, they could rescue it. And that's where our journey truly begins. In the next chapter, we'll meet Pi's descendants, the pharaohs who stood against Assyria, rebuilt temples, and dared to carve their stories into the very stone of Egypt, even as history tried to erase them. Because the truth, like the Nile, always finds its way back to the light. After Piye's death, the crown passed to his brother Shabaka, another Kushite king, who would take Egypt's throne not as a conqueror, but as a protector of its soul. Shabaka didn't just maintain what his brother had built, he expanded it. He understood the power of image ritual and divine authority. And unlike many pharaohs before him, Shabaka believed in the importance of memory. He wasn't content to let the past crumble, he wanted to preserve it. One of his first acts was to recover and recopy a decaying religious text, an ancient scroll containing Egypt's sacred creation myth. Instead of letting it fade away, Shabaka ordered it carved line by line into solid stone. That tablet is now known as the Shabaka stone, and it remains one of the most important religious artifacts from ancient Egypt. It was more than a restoration, it was a statement. The Black Pharaohs of Kush would not only protect Egypt, they would guard its legacy even from itself. Under Shabaka, temples were rebuilt, monuments were raised, and order returned to the land. But his rule was not without resistance. Some Egyptians still viewed the Kushites as foreigners, outsiders. The fact that they worshipped the same gods, spoke the same language, and ruled with greater reverence than the crumbling native dynasties before them didn't matter to some. To them, the skin was different. The land of origin was different, and that made all the difference. But Shabaka ruled with dignity. He placed himself not above Egypt's traditions, but within them. He honored the gods of Thebes, knelt before Amun, and wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. He wanted to be remembered not as a foreign king, but as a righteous one, and he was. Even today, scholars speak of Shabaka with admiration for his wisdom, his humility, and his spiritual depth. He wasn't just a pharaoh. He was a bridge between two cultures, two kingdoms, two bloodlines, joining the Nile in one heartbeat again. And yet history kept turning. As the years passed, a new storm gathered to the east. Assyria, a brutal and rising empire, had its eyes on Egypt. Its kings, fierce and expansionist, saw the land of the Nile not as sacred, but as strategic. A gateway to wealth, a symbol of dominance. They began to creep toward Egypt's borders. By the time Shabaka's nephew Taharqa took the throne, the threat had become unavoidable. Taharqa was perhaps the most famous of all the Black Pharaohs, a warrior king, a builder, a visionary. He had grown up during the golden days of Kushite rule, and now he would have to defend it with everything he had. And defend it he did. In the early years of his reign, he led campaigns into the Levant, challenging Assyrian advances in modern-day Israel and Palestine. His armies clashed with the world's most powerful empire and held them back. For a moment, the Nile stood tall again. Taharqa was hailed as a liberator in Jerusalem. He was called King of Kings in inscriptions. The Bible itself even refers to him, naming him as the king who fought to save Judah from Assyrian conquest. Imagine that, a black pharaoh of Nubian descent written into scripture. But empires never stop marching. Eventually, Assyria returned stronger, more ruthless, more determined. Their king Esarhaddon stormed through the eastern borders and made his way into Egypt, sacking cities and spreading terror. Taharqa fought valiantly. He pushed them back once, twice, but the cost was growing. His armies were stretched thin, his cities strained. His throne, though still upright, began to tremble, and in the shadows, new powers stirred Egyptians who resented Kushite rule, who saw the chaos as a chance to reclaim what had been theirs. Taharqa fled south, returning to Nubia. But even in retreat, he was not broken. He continued to rule from afar, sending aid to Egyptian allies, resisting Assyrian dominance, refusing to surrender. And yet, with every passing season, the sands of time shifted. After Taharqa came Tutankhamun, the last of the great Kushite pharaohs, to hold even a piece of Egypt. He too tried to reclaim the north. He fought bravely, reconquering Memphis and raising banners of unity once more. But Assyria was too strong, Egypt too divided, and the dream began to fade. Tutankhamun was forced to retreat. The Kushite dynasty, after nearly a century of ruling Egypt, was pushed back to Nubia. The 25th dynasty was over, and soon history began to erase them. Temples were destroyed, names chiseled off stone, statues buried or broken. A new dynasty, the 26th, rose from the Delta Egyptian-born, eager to wash away the memory of foreign kings. But what they couldn't erase was the truth, that for nearly 100 years, Egypt had been ruled by a line of black pharaohs. Kings from Kush, who didn't just conquer, but revived. Who restored temples, protected sacred texts, resisted invasion, and led with wisdom, faith, and strength. The world forgot them, but they were never gone. In the next part, we'll explore how these rulers were rediscovered and why their story was buried not just under sand, but under silence. Because sometimes the past isn't lost, it's just waiting to be seen again. For centuries, the memory of the Black Pharaohs was kept in shadows. Their names faded from temples. Their monuments fell. Their images, when found, were often misattributed or quietly dismissed. As time passed, even Egyptologists, those who devoted their lives to studying the land of the pharaohs, saw the 25th dynasty as a mere footnote, an interruption in Egypt's pure royal lineage. But memory has a way of surviving in silence. In the hills of Nubia, the pyramids of El Kuru and Nuri still stood smaller than the grand structures at Giza, but no less sacred. Wind-beaten and partially buried, they held within them the tombs of Taharka Tanutamun and their descendants. Long forgotten by the world, they had not been destroyed, only ignored. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that explorers and archaeologists, many of them European, began to take notice of what lay further south along the Nile. When they finally uncovered the royal burial grounds of ancient Nubia, they were stunned. Pyramids, carvings, inscriptions. Kings dressed in the regalia of pharaohs, gods of Egypt adorning the walls. Sarcophagi lined with gold leaf and sacred text. These weren't mere imitators, these were rulers. And not just any rulers, but the same kings whose names had once been erased from Egyptian temples. The same men who had united Egypt, who had fought Assyria, who had ruled with grace and strength. But even then, something strange happened. The findings were minimized. In academic circles, some dismissed the 25th dynasty as foreign occupiers, or categorized them as Nubian-style Egyptian kings, subtly separating them from the rest of the pharaonic tradition. Few textbooks highlighted them. Few museums gave them full exhibits. Their images were rarely used in media depictions of Egypt, and almost never were they described as Black African rulers of Egypt. Silence wasn't accidental. It was part of a deeper, uncomfortable truth that the idea of African kings of Black pharaohs ruling one of the most iconic civilizations in human history challenged colonial narratives that had shaped Western understanding of the ancient world. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Egypt was often portrayed as a Mediterranean civilization, somehow disconnected from the rest of Africa. Its achievements were marveled at, but carefully framed as the work of a culture more European-like than African. The Kushite dynasty shattered that illusion. Because their reign proved something undeniable: Africa ruled Africa. Not only that Black Africans ruled Egypt, revived Egypt, and defended it against one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world. It was a truth that made many historians uncomfortable. So for decades, the story was softened, diluted, buried beneath other dynasties, glossed over in classrooms. Until finally, new generations of scholars, many from Africa and the diaspora, began to ask a different question. Why were we never told this? And when they dug deeper, the truth came roaring back. Academic journals were re-examined. Tombs were studied again with fresh eyes. The pyramids of Sudan, numbering over 200 more than in all of Egypt, began drawing attention. And slowly, the story of the 25th dynasty returned to the light. Today, you can walk through Nubia's desert and still see the broken steps of those pyramids. You can visit the Museum of Sudanese History and find statues of Taharka, tall, regal, unmistakably African. You can read inscriptions carved in stone by kings who believed the gods had called them not to conquer, but to restore. And when you do, something shifts. You realize that history is not just about what happened. It's about who gets to remember it. The Black Pharaohs were real. They were powerful. And they left behind more than monuments. They left behind a challenge to us, the future. To question what we've been taught. To seek out what was silenced. To remember what was nearly erased. And perhaps most of all, to listen for voices long buried. Because once you hear them, you can't unhear them. In the next part, we'll dive into the legacy of these rulers in today's world, how their memory is being revived, reclaimed, and redefined by artists, scholars, and descendants alike. Because the past may be ancient, but its heartbeat is still with us. The world is waking up. After centuries of silence, the story of the Black Pharaohs is no longer hidden in dusty journals or buried beneath desert sands. It's rising through scholarship, through art, through voices that refuse to let history be written in half-truths. In universities across Africa, America, and beyond, young historians are re-examining what it means to be African in the ancient world. They're not just revisiting old texts, they're rewriting narratives, no longer content with the version of Egypt that erases its southern roots. They're connecting the dots between Kush and Kemet, between Nubia and the Nile. And at the heart of that reconnection stands Taharqa. He's more than a name carved into stone. He's become a symbol, a reminder that Africa's story is not one of absence or dependence, but one of greatness, contribution, and empire. His face, broad-nosed, strong-jawed, regal, is now reappearing in paintings, in poetry, in murals from New York to Nairobi. In recent years, films and documentaries have started to acknowledge the 25th dynasty. Books for children now include images of black pharaohs beside the more familiar names like Ramses or Tutankhamun. Musicians and writers are drawing inspiration from Nubian culture, weaving its symbols and philosophies into their work. And perhaps most powerfully, people of African descent whose roots stretch back through centuries of displacement are discovering in these pharaohs something deeply personal, a sense of ancestral pride. Because when you grow up being told that greatness came from elsewhere, that history happened without you, something in you begins to dim. But then, you see a king, a black king, ruling Egypt, standing against empires, protecting temples, rebuilding cities, and something inside reignites. Taharqa's statues were once buried. Now they stand tall in Sudan. His legacy, once muted, now speaks in classrooms, in art galleries, in street corners. A reminder not only of what was lost, but of what was always there. But this reclamation isn't just about pride, it's about justice. Because history isn't neutral. It reflects the values and power of those who tell it. And for far too long, the contributions of black civilizations have been filtered, framed, or forgotten. The 25th dynasty challenges that filter. It dares to say, look again. We were here. We led. We ruled. And it's not just Sudan and Egypt reclaiming this past. In the United States, where African American communities have long sought cultural connections to pre-colonial Africa, the story of the Kushite pharaohs offers something rare representation in antiquity. It shows that long before the transatlantic slave trade, before colonization, before forced erasure, there were kings, there were empires, there was legacy. For artists, this is gold. In Harlem, murals of Taharqa rise between city blocks. In Senegal, theater groups perform dramatizations of Paye's campaign through Egypt. In London, exhibitions finally place Nubian pyramids alongside those of Giza, treating them not as side notes, but as central to the Egyptian saga. Even in popular media, whispers of the Black Pharaohs are beginning to surface. Films set in ancient times are increasingly questioned for casting choices that fail to reflect the realities of African royalty. A global audience is watching and asking, where are the pharaohs who looked like us? The silence is cracking, and as it does, people are returning, not just to the tombs, but to the land. Tourism in Sudan is growing. The pyramids of Nuri and El Kuru, once isolated and forgotten, now draw visitors eager to stand where the kings once stood. There are no gift shops, no polished tour buses, just windstone and the weight of a story returning to the world. It's powerful, because it's not just about monuments, it's about meaning. The fact that these pyramids exist at all, that they still rise from the earth after thousands of years, is proof that the Black Pharaohs refused to be erased. Even when their names were chiseled away, even when historians looked elsewhere, even when time tried to forget them, they remained. And now they are rising again, not just from the sands, but from the silence. In the next part, we'll return to the land itself, to Kush, to Nubia, to the roots of an African kingdom that dared to dream bigger than its borders. A land that didn't just influence Egypt, but saved it. A land whose spirit, though ancient, still pulses beneath the Nile winds. Because to understand the pharaohs, we must first understand their home. To understand the Black Pharaohs, you have to leave the shadows of Egypt's temples and go south, beyond the first cataract where the Nile narrows and the cliffs rise, lies Nubia, or what the ancient Egyptians once called Ta Seti, the land of the bow. For centuries it was both a neighbor and a rival, a source of trade, tribute, and tension. But for the Kushites, it was home. This wasn't just a borderland, it was a civilization in its own right. Long before Pi marched into Egypt, the people of Nubia had built cities, temples, and pyramids of their own. They had their own kings, their own gods, their own way of life. And although Egypt's power often overshadowed them in historical texts, Nubia thrived sometimes under Egyptian rule, sometimes resisting it, but always maintaining its distinct identity. This is what makes the rise of the 25th dynasty so extraordinary. It wasn't just a story of foreign kings taking power. It was the moment when the southern heart of Africa reclaimed the crown of the north. And it wasn't by accident, it was by tradition, strategy, and belief. The Kushites saw themselves not as invaders, but as inheritors of Egypt's divine mission. They worshipped Amun just as the Thebans did. They performed the same rituals, spoke a closely related language, and preserved customs that had begun to fade in Egypt's politically fragmented north. Their capital at Napata, nestled beneath the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, became a spiritual center. Priests declared it to be the home of Amun himself, making it not just a political stronghold, but a holy city. And there, surrounded by sandstone cliffs and desert winds, the Kushite kings built their pyramids, smaller than those of Giza, but no less powerful. In meaning, these tombs stood as declarations: we are pharaohs too. We are chosen. We are eternal. The architecture is stunning, narrow, steep-sided pyramids with small temples at their base. The interior walls speak of judgment, of resurrection, of the pharaoh's soul traveling to the stars. Though time and looters have worn them down, the energy in these tombs remains. You can feel it in the silence, in the heat, in the echo of your own breath inside stone built for gods. And the legacy didn't stop with the fall of the 25th dynasty. The Kushite kingdom moved further south, establishing a new capital at Meroe, where it flourished for another 600 years. There, the Nubians developed a unique writing system, built ironworks, expanded trade routes, and continued pyramid building long after Egypt had abandoned the practice. Yet again, their achievements were overlooked. For decades, Meroe was a mystery. Western archaeologists often passed it by, calling it provincial or minor. But today we know better. We know that Meroe was a city of learning, of queens and kings, of bold architecture and powerful ritual. A place where women could rule as Kandaki queen mothers and monarchs in their own right. A place where black royalty was not a fantasy, but a fact. Nubia's endurance speaks volumes. Even as Egypt declined under Persian, Greek, and Roman control, the Kushites held firm. Their culture, rooted in both African tradition and Egyptian belief, adapted and survived. For nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the 25th dynasty, their civilization continued independent, proud, and rich in spirit. And yet, most of us were never taught this. We learned about the pyramids of Egypt, but not those of Sudan. We read about Ramses and Cleopatra, but not about Paye or Amanitore. We memorized timelines that skipped over the Black Pharaohs entirely, as if their rule had been a mistake. But the land remembers. The Nile still flows through Nubia. The temples still stand, some hidden, some half-sunken beneath dam waters, some proudly rising from golden earth. And the people descendants of that ancient bloodline still live in villages along the river, telling stories their ancestors once whispered beneath the stars. Today, a new generation is returning to these roots. Sudanese scholars are documenting the language of Meroe. Local guides are leading visitors through Nubian ruins with pride. African archaeologists are leading digs once dominated by foreign institutions. Slowly, the narrative is shifting, not just toward truth, but toward ownership. Because history is not just what we inherit. It's what we claim, what we say out loud, what we lift from silence and carry forward. And Nubia, land of the Black Pharaohs, is no longer content to be a footnote. In the next part, we'll look at how these rediscovered legacies are reshaping identity and pride today, especially among young Africans and the global diaspora. Because this story isn't just ancient, it's personal. In today's world, history is no longer locked in libraries. It lives in lyrics, in murals, in TikTok, videos, in fashion, runways, in poetry slams. It's being pulled out of ancient texts and painted on street walls. And among young Africans and members of the global Black diaspora, the story of the Black Pharaohs is no longer a surprise, it's a statement. Because when you grow up in a world that often denies your ancestors, their brilliance finding out that kings like Taharka ruled Egypt isn't just interesting, it's empowering. Across Africa, students are questioning the way history has been taught. They're challenging colonial textbooks that downplayed African civilizations or framed them as passive bystanders. They're saying, we had cities, we had armies, we had temples before Europe had castles. In Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, educators are rebuilding curricula that include the 25th dynasty. Kids are learning not just about pyramids in Giza, but about those in Nuri and Meroe. They're seeing pharaohs with features that look like their own. And suddenly, ancient history becomes more than just distant, it becomes personal. In the United States and the Caribbean, artists of African descent are weaving the imagery of the Black Pharaohs into their work. Rap verses reference King Paye. Photographers stage portraits inspired by Nubian queens. Clothing lines use symbols from Kushite architecture to decorate jackets and jewelry. And it's not just aesthetic, it's ancestral. These creative expressions say what so many textbooks never did. You come from greatness. You are the descendants of empire builders, thinkers, leaders. You were never invisible. Online hashtags like Thabu Black Pharaohs, Nubian kings, and 25th dynasty are uniting communities across continents. People are sharing images of statues with wide noses and locked hair. They're making memes. They're telling the world, we were here and we're still here. But reclaiming this history isn't just about pride, it's also about healing. Because for centuries, Black communities around the world were taught to see their lineage through the lens of slavery, colonization, and struggle. Their history began in chains, or so it seemed. But the story of the Black Pharaohs breaks that narrative open. It says, before they took your freedom, you had kingdoms. It reminds people that their story didn't begin in bondage, it began in power. That realization has sparked something deeper, a return. A return to research, a return to roots. Young scholars in the diaspora are now traveling to Sudan to study pyramids, partnering with local experts, learning Nubian languages, and helping digitize ancient records once left in ruins. In universities across the globe, new dissertations are being written about the 25th dynasty, not as an interruption in Egyptian history, but as a central chapter. The language has changed. No longer the Nubian invaders, but the Kushite unifiers. No longer outsiders, but restorers. This matters, because words shape perception, and perception shapes reality. The more these pharaohs are spoken of with dignity and truth, the more their descendants and the world begin to see Africa not as a continent of lack, but as a birthplace of legacy. And for those who never knew this story, it becomes a revelation. Imagine being a teenager in New York, or Lagos, or Paris, hearing for the first time that there was a Black king who ruled all of Egypt, who stood toe-to-toe with Assyria, who's mentioned in the Bible, who built pyramids and temples, who was buried in stone so sacred that the wind still whispers his name. It changes how you walk, how you speak, how you see yourself. Because now, when you stand tall, you're not just standing for yourself, you're standing for generations. You're standing for Pie, for Shabaka, for Taharka, for the kings whose stories were almost lost, and for those who kept them alive in silence. And yet the journey of reclamation is far from over. There are still many who have never heard of the 25th dynasty. Still textbooks that skip it. Still museums that fail to represent Nubia with the honor it deserves. Still voices waiting to be heard. But the current is changing. It's in the music. It's in the murals. It's in the classroom. It's in the smile of a child who sees a pharaoh who looks like them and realizes, I am part of this story too. And once that door opens, it doesn't close. In the next part, we'll return to the pyramids of Sudan, this time not as ruins, but as rising symbols of rebirth. We'll explore what they look like today, what secrets they still hold, and why they may become one of the most important archaeological frontiers of our time. Because some monuments aren't just made of stone, they're made of memory. And memory, once awakened, never sleeps. In the deserts of northern Sudan, beyond the reach of tour buses and souvenir shops, stand pyramids few people have ever heard of, let alone visited. They rise not in crowds like Giza, but in quiet lines standing guard over the forgotten kings of Kush. Their peaks are sharp, their faces worn by wind, their stones kissed by the sun and sand for over 2,000 years. These are the pyramids of Nuri el Kuru and Meroe, the final resting places of the Black Pharaohs. When you walk among them, it's not grandeur that strikes you. It's silence, a kind of sacred stillness that feels almost protective, as if the desert itself has kept these tombs hidden for a reason not out of neglect, but out of reverence. They are smaller than Egypt's giants, but no less meaningful. Many are built atop royal tombs, carved deep into the bedrock. Some contain chambers filled with hieroglyphs, sacred inscriptions, or remains of golden artifacts, now scattered through private collections or museum basements. Others were looted centuries ago. Some have yet to be explored at all, and that is where the story begins again. In recent years, archaeologists, many of them Sudanese, have returned to these ancient sites with new tools and a new mission to uncover, preserve, and celebrate the legacy the world once tried to erase. One such project is led by Dr. Nuha Salim, a Sudanese-born Egyptologist working alongside global teams. Her goal is not only to excavate, but to recenter Sudan in the historical conversation. For too long, she says, the pyramids of Nubia were treated as Egypt's distant cousin, interesting but secondary. That mindset is changing. With satellite imaging, drone surveys, and 3D scanning, researchers are now documenting hundreds of pyramids across Sudan's northern region. Each structure has a story, each foundation a connection to a forgotten name. Pie, Shabaka, Taharka, Tanutamun, Amani Shaketo, Shanaktakete, queens, kings, warriors, priests. The work is painstaking. The desert is harsh. Funding is limited. But the discoveries are remarkable. One team recently uncovered a hidden tomb shaft beneath a Nubian pyramid untouched since antiquity. Another group, using ground-penetrating radar, found what may be an unexcavated royal burial site, possibly older than any previously known. These are not just ruins, they are portals to a past far richer than we imagined. And yet, even as discoveries unfold, these pyramids remain in danger. Climate change, erosion, illegal excavation, encroaching development, and perhaps worst of all, global indifference. While millions travel to Egypt's Giza Plateau each year, the pyramids of Sudan sit largely forgotten. They are not featured on posters. They rarely appear in tourism ads. Even UNESCO, though recognizing the significance of Meroe, struggles to direct global attention to what may be one of the most important archaeological landscapes in Africa. But there is hope. Sudan's Ministry of Antiquities, local communities, and African cultural institutions are fighting to protect and promote these sacred sites. Educational programs are bringing school children to see the pyramids, some for the first time. Artists are painting them into murals. Documentaries are telling their stories in languages people can understand. And slowly travelers are coming, not in hordes, but in small numbers. Historians, filmmakers, descendants of the diaspora people who want to stand where the Black Pharaohs once stood. Who want to feel the wind that carried prayers from temple steps into eternity. Because something happens when you see them up close. They're not just stone. They're memory. They're defiance. They are proof that history is bigger than the stories we were told, and that Africa's past is not one of darkness, but of light. These pyramids rewrite everything. They challenge ideas of who built what, who ruled whom, and whose face deserves to be carved into eternity. They remind us that Egypt was not a world apart from Africa, but deeply, beautifully connected to it. And they invite us to ask, what else have we forgotten? What other legacies lie beneath the sand waiting for someone to care enough to find them? In the next and final part, we'll bring this journey full circle, revisiting the power of remembering the danger of erasure, and the truth that once rediscovered cannot be buried again. Because the Black Pharaohs may have passed into legend, but their story is still being written by us. History is not just about what we remember. It's also about what we choose to forget. For far too long, the Black Pharaohs of Egypt were buried beneath silence, not because they lacked greatness, but because their greatness disrupted the stories others wanted to tell. They proved that Black kings didn't just belong to myth or legend. They ruled empires. They built pyramids. They read the stars, prayed to gods, led armies, wrote in stone. And they did all of this not in the shadows of Egypt, but in its heart. Pie, Shabaka, Taharka, Tanutamun. Their names echo now where once there was silence. And as they rise again in classrooms and museums, in the imagination of a new generation, something shifts not just in history, but in identity. Because when we see ourselves in the past, we see new possibilities for the future. We begin to understand that greatness isn't confined to a geography or a skin tone or a set of statues in a Western museum. It lives wherever people dared to dream, to build, to fight for a vision of the world larger than themselves. And the kings of Kush, they dreamed in stone. They saw the chaos of Egypt and dared to restore it. They were men of war and worship, of memory and mission. They knew they might not be remembered, but they left monuments anyway. And now here we are, remembering. Telling their story not because it's fashionable, but because it's true. Because they earned their place in history, not by asking for it, but by carving it brick by brick into the very earth they ruled. So what do we do with this story? We share it. We teach it to our children. We speak the names aloud. We challenge the narrow versions of the past. We travel, if only in thought, to the pyramids of Nubia, and let the silence there remind us of everything that still matters. Because history lives not in books or buildings. It lives in us, in our curiosity, in our courage to ask better questions, in our refusal to let anyone's legacy be forgotten. And if this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to a past you never knew existed, then let it live on through your voice. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave us a comment. What surprised you most? What do you want to learn next? And most of all, thank you for listening. Really listening to a history that once had no voice. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay curious and keep remembering.